This is the incredible true story of the chocolate-loving English pirate who started a famous American university and was held hostage by a jungle tribe in Panama, a tribe ripped off by the world's largest athletic shoe company. It's 1679. The most famous pirates in all of history are alive at this very moment. Captain Morgan is in control of Port Royal, Jamaica, a crucial pirate hideout. Captain Kidd is sailing the seas. Alexander Selkirk, a future pirate and castaway who will inspire the tale of Robinson Crusoe, is just learning to walk and talk. And a young pregnant woman somewhere in England is about to give birth to Edward Teach, best known as Blackbeard the pirate. But this story is not about these famous men. It's about a pirate who was known and sought after in his time, but one who has been lost to history, Lionel Wafer. In 1679, he's about 20 years old, broke, and living in England. Wafer's youth is largely a mystery, with some later sources claiming he was a Welshman, while others state he was alternatively English, Irish, or Scottish, and born around 1660. Adventurous as always, Wafer himself says he spent a good deal of his youth bouncing around in Ireland and Scotland, where he learned to speak Highland, an old Irish language used in specific parts of Northern Ireland and Scotland at the time. Knowledge of this, quote, primitive, as he called it, Irish language will prove far more useful to Wafer than you can ever imagine. Back in England in 1679, Wafer was desperate to see his brother, a brother who worked at the Injures, a Jamaican plantation of Sir Thomas Mudiford, the ex-governor of Bob Marley's island. The Angel Plantation was the only one in the region that commercialized a natural red dye called annatto. Wafer arrived at this very plantation and stayed for a short while with the brother he so missed. Eventually, though, he needed to make a living, so he settled in a house in Port Royal. In Port Royal, Wafer practiced medicine for a few months. Not long after settling in, Wafer joined two pirates, Captains John Cook and Stephen Lynch. Cook would later become a daring pirate off the coast of Guinea, harassing Danish ships with elaborate ruses. However, little is known about Lynch. The three men planned to head off towards the coast of Cartagena. Along the way there, a storm forced them to regroup on Golden Island, in the Sambaloes, as Panama's San Blas Islands used to be called in Wafer's day. This is where Wafer's team first met and mustered forces with other important British and French pirates of the time, including William Dampier, as well as Basil Ringrose and Bartholomew Sharp. This rendezvous was very fortuitous for all the pirates involved. That's because although pirates have a reputation for being stupid criminals, this is often a fake Hollywood narrative that paints with a very broad brush. The truth was commonly quite different. These specific pirates were instead highly intelligent fortune seekers. Wafer, as you know, was a doctor. Dampier's navigation skills saved countless lives through 3 circumnavigations around the world. Basil Ringrose was an extremely skilled cartographer whose meticulous maps were of immense military and economic importance to the pirates and the English crown for years to come. All the while, Bartholomew Sharp provided such fearless, even if at times unpopular, leadership that his frightening exploits inspired a saying still used in parts of Chile to this very day: "Ya llegó el charpe a Coquimbo," a phrase used to denote that an uninvited, unforeseen, if not scary guest has arrived. All in all, this group of pirates was closer in skill to astronauts than random bank robbers. From their rendezvous on Golden Island, they decided to land on the Spanish-controlled Isthmus of Darien, which is the historical term for what is now largely Panama. To imagine what these men faced upon landing, you only have to look at what a large section of this land, called the Darien or Darien Gap, looks like today. It's basically untouched by time, which allows us to approximate what Wafer went through. It's a hot, wet, impenetrable jungle. Jaguars, crocodiles, venomous snakes, and deadly spiders lurk around every corner. Up to 4,500 millimeters of rain falls here every year, which is nearly 5 times the average amount rainy cities like Seattle experience. Every year, dozens, if not hundreds of migrants and hikers disappear and die crossing this very land from exposure, drowning, disease, deadly animals, and from dangerous men. It was no different for Wafer and his friends, except back then the Spanish hunted the pirates mercilessly in this stretch of land, and some of the native tribes here weren't that friendly either. All of this proved too much for the French pirates in the group. They flat out refused to join the British ones on a long march into the Isthmus of Darien, and so abandoned the expedition with their 2 ships and 111 men. Wafer, Dampier, and the rest of the merry men were undeterred. Using their remaining 7 ships and 366 men, they decided they wanted to capture Santa Maria, which essentially doubled as a Spanish gold mining town and a fort on the isthmus. The pirates voted in Sharp as this expedition's chief leader, a position he could lose at any time if the other pirates were dissatisfied. Contrary to Hollywood fiction, though, which depicts bloody pirate mutinies, such changes in pirate leadership were usually bloodless, relatively civil, and very democratic. This shouldn't surprise you in the least bit from a logical point of view. No pirate was going to risk his life in battle unless his leader was capable and demonstrated exactly that on the front lines with his men. And no pirate wanted to lead a group of men who didn't want to fight under his command. That could lead to desertion, cowardice, and disaster for everyone. Therefore, multiple changes of leadership in just a single pirate expedition were not unheard of, with deposed leaders sometimes being voted back into power at a later time on the same trip if the pirates thought it was a good idea. Upon landing on the isthmus on April 5, 1680, 35 of the pirates were left to guard the ships, whereas the rest of the 331 men started marching towards Santa Maria. Wafer and the other pirates were armed solely with pistols, fusees, and hangers. For food, they took 3 to 4 cakes of bread, or doughboys as they called them. For water, they relied on the rivers, and for safe passage, they took gifts of toys and trinkets for the natives, managing to procure many native guides through this area in this way. To be clear, the pirates didn't always barter toys and other useless stuff for safe passage. They just happened to in this expedition. In other cases, Wafer, Dampier, and the others would gift knives, scissors, beads, and other things the natives found quite valuable, like mirrors. Moreover, procuring native guides in exchange for gifts wouldn't have been terribly difficult for Wafer and the others. That's because a large proportion of native tribes absolutely hated the Spanish colonizers, who de facto broke their own laws and enslaved or treated the natives extremely poorly as compared to many of the English pirates. In contrast, the pirates were more likely to come bearing gifts for the indigenous Panamanians, choosing to use African slaves on their journeys instead. I know, the paradox, irony, and ethics here are very unsettling and confusing, but I thought it worth juxtaposing for you to paint a fairer picture of what went on during this time as the men pressed on towards Santa Maria. During this trek through the jungle, the pirates built basic and temporary huts to overnight in because lying in the grass was terribly dangerous, being filled with a lot of gigantic, venomous snakes that even the natives were extremely cautious of. Luckily, a part of their journey was made relatively easy and quick, for they took advantage of rivers along the way, as well as large native plantations that dotted the area. This is of some importance, for our pirate friends noted that the natives had a lot of plantations throughout the jungle, replete with thick layers of rich black soil in some places, which allowed for giant trees and bountiful harvests to grow. In other words, the natives didn't just live off the wild jungle fruits and animals, they were in part an agricultural society, and their agricultural plantations provided occasional but quick and easy paths to cut through the surrounding jungle. This is why Wafer and other pirates referred to many of these jungle plantations as walks, as in cacao walks, which would be composed of 500 to 2,000 cacao trees either side of large avenues that you could easily walk through. Among other things, the natives in this area grew plantains, cassava, corn, and sugarcane, which they gave to the extremely tired pirates to suck on for energy through their march in the jungle. And the corn was used by the natives not only for food, but as a counting tool. That's because they didn't really understand math the way we do today, often having no real concept of numbers beyond 100, which forced them to express large numbers in vague ways that are not too dissimilar from the ways of the Amazonian Piraha tribe today. So, the natives would drop a kernel of corn as each of the 331 pirates passed by in order to try and visually approximate and explain to others just how many of these pirates were in the area. Despite these river highways and open plantations, I don't want to make it seem like the trek through the jungle was a cakewalk or something. Their march through the jungle was extremely hot, humid, muddy, and treacherous. Even the rivers only provided occasional relief from the painful march over land. That's because sandbars, rocks, and fallen trees often forced the pirates to get out of the canoes the natives had provided and heave those canoes over the obstacles in the perilous water. Neither do I want to make it seem like the pirates were completely at the mercy of native help. Even though native guides were a huge help, the pirates were skilled bushmen who relied on their own abilities to survive as much as on the locals. For example, do you know how the pirates distinguished poisonous jungle fruits from edible ones? Was it okay, I'm not going to do that to you. They looked at the birds. If the birds ate the fruit, then it was likely safe to eat. If the birds stayed away from the fruit, then they avoided the fruit unless they knew better. But the pirates and birds weren't the only hungry animals in the jungle. Halfway to Santa Maria, a large cat, likely a jaguar, wanted to eat one of the pirates, stalking the group, waiting for a weak one that it could bring down at night. In fear, the men wanted to shoot the feline, but came to their senses. A gunshot would have alerted the Spanish that they were near Santa Maria. So the pirates just had to pray the jaguar wouldn't attack them when they went to the bathroom in the middle of the night. I'm definitely glad that I wasn't there. After roughly 9.5 days march of 40 miles or so, the pirates reached Santa Maria on Thursday, April 15th, and took it with little effective resistance, suffering only 2 wounded men and no loss of life. After all that trouble and danger marching through the jungle, to their great dismay, all of their efforts and risks were for naught. There was essentially no treasure to be had and no important Spaniards to seize for ransom, nor intelligence purposes either. Santa Maria turned out to be a dinky little garrison only recently built at the time, where even the Spanish homes were primitive and made of simple cane. And the 300 pounds of gold once stored there was already removed by the Spanish, who had received advance intelligence on the incoming English pirates, fleeing with their highest-ranking men in response as well. That means Wafer and his compadres missed out on $11.5 million worth of gold in today's prices. If split equally, that's roughly $35,000 per pirate for 10 days of very hard work. $3,500 per day sounds like a lot, but let's not forget the months of toil they put in on other adventures and preparations where they earned nothing. It goes to show that real pirates rarely made a killing worth retiring on, even if they lived long enough to discover a huge treasure. For the next 367 days, Wafer continued on with this core group of pirates, rising to the rank of chief chirurgeon, at the time the term used for doctor or surgeon. While his medical rank rose, his metaphorical bank account did not. During this year of failure, as I'll call it, Wafer and the rest of the pirates sailed along the coast of Central and South America, trying to seize ships and plunder towns along the way. They largely failed in these endeavors, or when they succeeded, they usually found little in the way of treasure on board the ships or in the towns they seized. Many of the original group of some 300 men died or abandoned the pirate fleet, fed up with their lack of success and the rising tensions within the group, likely as a result of all of that failure. I don't want to sound too negative about the year of failure either. At least for us, as fans of history, there were a lot of very interesting highlights documented through this and subsequent trips. For example, with no exaggeration, did you know that these very pirates were arguably the world's first chocolate connoisseurs? After all, they were among the first ones to travel through the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, where different varieties of cacao were cultivated and chocolate products were made. William Dampier styled himself as the world's first, or at least finest, chocolate expert, going so far as to lightly ridicule Basil Ringrose about the latter's crude and limited taste in the confection. Ringrose believed that Ecuadorian chocolate was the best, while Dampier much preferred the Venezuelan kind. After falling flat in Santa Maria, and after a year of failure thereafter, on April 17, 1681, Wafer was on board the Trinity, an absolutely massive 400-ton pirate galleon. The Trinity was a former Spanish treasure ship that escaped the clutches of Captain Henry Morgan when he attacked Panama City years earlier. Trinity's escape didn't last, however, and it was eventually captured and placed under the command of our very own Bartholomew Sharp. At the end of this year of failure, Sharp faced a mutiny when the Trinity was anchored at or just a few miles north of Isla de la Plata, Spanish for Silver Island, which is near Ecuador. The island was also called Drake's Island at the time, because legend had it that Sir Francis Drake, a famous pirate from the 1500s, brought a large amount of silver onto the island. This was likely a myth, however. Either way, the Trinity wasn't at the island looking for buried pirate treasure. It had stopped because there was a mutiny on board. Somewhat bafflingly, given his documented track record, but not surprisingly given the tensions on board, Bartholomew Sharp was specifically accused of cowardice by some of the pirates, and not for the first time. See, backstabbing and politicking was rife on board by this time, with men switching sides left and right, exchanging unkind words, rumors, and accusations. But Sharp was not worried about having to walk the plank to his death, however. This was more Hollywood myth than pirate fact. Remember, such mutinies were usually fully democratic processes despite the raw emotions involved. During this mutiny, John Cook was put forward as an alternate leader to Sharp, and a special kind of vote was proposed. The winning leader and the voters who thus carried the majority of the popular vote would keep the safety and most of the provisions of the Trinity. The voters in the minority and their chosen leader would be given 2 canoes and Trinity's boat launch. As a direct result of this, the minority would be left with few supplies and almost no protection from the elements and the Spanish in the area. Therefore, the minority group would be forced to make a grueling journey through the Spanish-controlled seas and lands in order to make it back into the relative safety of the Caribbean, where they could rest and regroup. The vote was held. Basil Ringrose stuck with Sharp, who carried the majority of the vote, while Wafer and Dampier in the minority sided with Cook. And so Wafer, Dampier, and Cook, as well as 41 other pirates, 3 native guides and 5 slaves of African origin set off towards the Caribbean. Speed was of the essence in their exposed state. Experience dictated one sure fact. Anyone in the group who fell behind would be captured by the merciless Spanish. Under torture, they'd reveal the location of the rest of the pirates. To prevent this, all of Cook's men agreed to be shot if they couldn't keep up. At first, things went pretty well. Wafer and the rest of the mutineers made it to the Pacific coast of Panama and started crossing the jungle towards the Caribbean side. On May 5th, 1681, the group decided to rest. Wafer was chilling near a mound of black granules, while a fellow pirate lit a pipe in order to relax as well. Carelessly, Pipe Man over here walked by Wafer while smoking, and a small, glowing ember silently fell from the pipe and slowly drifted down to earth. Those black granules, of course, were gunpowder, drying off from the jungle rain and humidity in the daylight sun, just in case the powder needed to be used against the Spanish forces in the area. Wafer's knee was nearly blasted off by the lightning explosion that followed, the flesh torn away, the bone shining a bright white in a sea of screaming red. He's now injured in the unforgiving Isthmus of Darien, full of hungry jaguars who can smell his blood from far away, and deadly tropical microbes penetrating his bloodstream. The Spanish dominating the area could unleash a volley of musket fire at the pirates at any moment, and the blast surely gives away their position. The pirates are desperate to cut through the mosquito-drenched rainforest at a raging pace and make it to the safety of the Caribbean shore. Fear strikes everyone with the situation at hand. Wafer, now clearly the weakest link, is faced with the agreement everyone had consented to earlier. Slow everyone down and get shot by your own men. Instead, Wafer uses his medical kit to do what he can to bandage himself up, and through sheer will and adrenaline, he keeps up with the rest of the men for 5 more days, fearful of getting shot for falling behind. But his luck runs out. During a careless moment, a slave runs off with most of his medical supplies. The pain is now too much and his body gives out. Miles from any help, Wafer resigns himself to his fate. Most of the other men, Dampier included, decide to march on. But they don't shoot Wafer while leaving. In hindsight, Wafer realizes that this threat was a motivational or scare tactic more so than anything else, in order to get everyone to move as quickly as possible. So Wafer agrees to be left behind in the thick jungle and to deal with the, quote, savages, as the natives were unfortunately called at the time. But he also knows that the Kuna natives of the region they're in want revenge, and that they know exactly where he is. Lionel Wafer has no idea what's about to happen to him. Luckily for us, the Kuna people are still with us to this day. There's just one small problem here. Wafer never used the term Kuna to refer to the indigenous people whose lands he was left behind in. Instead, he called them the Darien Indians. So how do we know that it was the Kuna he interacted with? Well, 2 main things. First, Wafer and others left behind numerous descriptions of the Darien Indians' culture, customs, and language. And although much has changed in the past 350 years, this has helped us link the Darien Indians to the Kuna. For instance, Wafer was taught by a Darien chief that if a pregnant mother looked at the moon and used her imagination, she would give birth to an albino child. Today's Kuna call their albino siblings and friends moon children. And second, there's this little thing called, oh, that's right, genetics. Wafer and other pirates were very much aware of the relatively large number of so-called white Indians living among the Darien natives. As it turns out, the Kuna have an extraordinarily noticeable rate of albinism. Wafer estimated that the rate of albinism was about 0.3% to 0.5% of the population. His keen observations correspond to modern measurements, which put the rate at roughly 0.6% of the total population. For perspective, this is 87 times higher than the rate of albinism in Denmark. It's basically a genetic signature that ties the Kuna back to Wafer's so-called Darien Indians. Long after Wafer's journey through this area, Spanish exploitation and malarial disease forced the Kuna to flee their ancestral Darien lands onto the relative safety of the Sambaloes, which, if you recall, is where Wafer and Dampier rendezvoused before attacking Santa Maria. Today, the Sambaloes are called the San Blas Islands, or Gunayala. Even here, though, the Kuna aren't safe. Rising sea levels and other factors will force them off the islands by the year 2100 or so. Unfortunately, the exploitation of the Kunas didn't stop with the colonial powers. Recently, a famous footwear company, I won't name because they might sue me for pointing out that they did something wrong, released a shoe that basically stole a Kuna indigenous design in a culturally insensitive way, pretended it was a Puerto Rican design, and hoped to make a tidy profit without benefiting the tribe. Luckily, someone caught on to this and forced the company to stop making the shoe. After Dampier and most of the other pirates left, the Kuna's ancestors decided that they wouldn't kill the injured Wafer immediately, even if they were really mad at the entire group of pirates. You see, when Wafer was left behind, 2 native guides volunteered to take Dampier and most of the other pirates to the Caribbean coast, so long as the guides could have 2 days to tend to important local matters first, perhaps cultural, personal, or political matters. The real reason is lost to history. But Cook Dampier and the other men flat out refused the Kuna's request, likely for fear of the Spanish catching up to them, or for fear of missing a rendezvous ship on the Caribbean coast. So the pirates literally just got up to leave. This forced the Kuna guides to cut short their important plans in order to claim the extremely valuable hatchets that Cook's party had promised them in return for their help. Worst of all, the guides were expected to come back pretty quickly after dropping off the pirates on the Caribbean side of the isthmus, but they hadn't shown up as expected and were missing for days on end. The Kuna suspected that the guides had been murdered by the pirates and they wanted justice. They told Wafer that if the guides don't return in 10 days, they're going to roast them alive. Literally. Despite this, the Kuna remain as hospitable to Wafer as they can be. Yes, they throw him unripe plantains to eat, which isn't very nice, but they also chew on medicinal herbs, spit them onto plantain leaves in order to make a medical paste, and dress Wafer's rotting leg every day with fresh bandages. And except for a mild weakness and numbness that never went away, Wafer was eventually cured this way. On day 10, the guides hadn't come back. The Kuna start preparing the firewood. Wafer is about to be burned at the stake. As night falls, Chief Lacenta, or Lacenta, the leader of all the Kuna in the area, just happens to pass by. When he arrives, he learns of the Kuna's plan and advises them otherwise. Literally, the man saved Wafer's life with mere seconds to spare. Lacenta tells Wafer and the other remaining pirates to take 2 village guides and retrace the steps the missing guides took in order to figure out what happened to them. As soon as the men set out, the wet season begins and the torrential rains are unrelenting. Just a few days into their journey to the east coast of Panama, they went to sleep only to find that at dawn, what was solid land all around had turned into an island due to the rain. probably afraid for their own lives, the Kuna guides abandoned the pirates to their fate without any supplies, not even food. For 8 days, the starving men fight to live, nearly drowning on several occasions. One dark night, Wafer has to climb up inside of a large rotten tree to escape the raging water coming for him. Finally, they spot wild hog tracks, which they know would often lead to a Kuna plantain or potato plantation. You should have seen the look on the Kuna's faces when they saw Wafer and the other pirates approach. They couldn't believe they had survived. There was even more good news. During Wafer's near-death experience, literally, the original guides finally made it back to the village. They bragged about how well Cook, Dampier, and the rest of the pirates treated them, and gave them all sorts of amazing gifts beyond their wildest dreams as a massive thanks for their service. In a flash, the Kuna warm immensely to Wafer and tell him they'd be happy to help him get to the coast and onto a waiting ship. But the rainy season, logistically speaking, means that he's going to be stuck with them for a long time. During this time, Wafer goes to great lengths to paint the Kuna as a naturally very helpful and peaceful people. He even does his best to help the Kuna in other ways. For instance, Wafer used a bloodletting technique to, quote, cure Lacenta's wife of a serious fever. Obviously, the cure was likely coincidence, but it nevertheless greatly elevated his status within the Kuna community. So much so that Lacenta didn't want to let him go, as Wafer became the chief's unwitting close companion. In fact, Wafer knew he'd become a de facto hostage, albeit one that was now treated very well. Yes, he wasn't chained or locked up like a movie hostage, but he was still a hostage, a man forced to stay against his will even when the weather improved. Lacenta had no desire to let his prized asset, doctor, and quote-unquote friend go. Now you might be thinking, why didn't Wafer just escape? Surely Wafer contemplated escape, but he knew that if he tried to escape, he'd be caught, if not worse. That's because the pirates clearly documented that the Kuna could cross the same stretch of land in half the time an Englishman could, owing to their familiarity and natural abilities in the area. Wafer simply didn't stand a chance in a race to the coast. So he resigned himself to his fate. He eventually literally becomes one of the natives. If you can't beat them, join them, right? He lives with them, hunts with them, runs around literally naked with them. He even got his nose pierced, just like them. One thing Wafer seemed to genuinely enjoy was Kuna body painting. The women were the chief body painters, and they delighted in their work. They'd chew on the end of a stick to the point where the end was as soft as a paintbrush. Then they'd mix natural dyes with oils in such a way that the paint stayed on the body for weeks like a temporary tattoo. Using combinations of brightly blue, red, and yellow colors, they painted plants, birds, animals, people, and other shapes as decorations, for sunscreen, as an insect repellent, and as part of a war ritual. Wafer would have instantly recognized the red annatto dye he, his brother, and Dampier saw at the Angel Plantation in Jamaica years before. Perhaps most amazingly, Wafer went so far as to learn and document the Kuna language. This is where his mastery of the Highland language came in, for he said the throat-like pronunciations and sounds of this old Irish tongue were very similar to the Kuna language. For fun, here's a small sample of words and phrases he wrote down for posterity, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing. Also, note that all languages change in 350 years, and Kuna is no exception. Nauna, mother. Pakekwa, 4. And my very favorite, Papunahita Kaupa. Woman, have you got the hammock? I wonder if Wafer was playing a little joke on the reader with that last phrase. I have no idea why he decided to document, but I found it a little bit hilarious. Eventually, Wafer managed to convince Lacenta to let him go, on two conditions. Wafer must return with hunting dogs and, upon his return, marry Lacenta's daughter, to which Wafer agrees. I mean, what choice did he have? Shortly after this agreement, the Kuna hold a powwow, as they themselves called it back then. For the Kuna, a powwow was a custom where specialized members of the community held a complex, noisy, and quite sweaty ritual to predict the future. Wafer was even allowed to participate at one point. In his case, the ritual predicted the arrival of two ships in 10 days' time, who would fire one cannon and then another. The prediction also mentioned that one person would die during the rendezvous. Sure enough, on the 10th day, two ships arrived, firing one cannon and then another. Unsure if the sailors on board those ships were English or Spanish, Wafer set off with some Kuna and other men towards the sailors in canoes. As predicted, one man drowned on the way. Wafer got on board one of the ships, largely naked, painted in colorful Kuna colors, with a nose piercing hanging over his lips. Dampier and the others on board look at Wafer, but pay little attention to him. They seem to have thought that he was simply a, quote, white Indian, a Kuna albino, of which they'd seen plenty of before. Dampier also knew that some Kuna knew some English, and so an English-speaking Kuna albino was rare but not unbelievable. The sailors simply ignored Wafer. Only a full hour later, after a bunch of back and forth, a man, not Dampier, finally recognized Wafer for who he really was, and hilarity ensued on board the ship. Wafer was finally safe. This basically ends the main portion of Wafer's own chronological account of his travels, but his entertaining journeys don't stop there. In addition to his writings, he is of enough importance for his era that other memoirs and historical documents clue us into the fact that he continued to sail the seas for years to come all over the world. In fact, Wafer even stayed in colonial British America, where he arrived in Philadelphia in May 1688. He even thought of retiring around Virginia, until he was put into a Jamestown jail for nearly 2 years on charges of piracy. After his loot, valued at no less than $40,000 to $200,000 US today, depending on calculation and valuation methods, after this loot was impounded, Wafer was allowed to get back to England in 1690. But not without one last twist to this incredible tale. 2 years later, in 1692, a lawsuit allowed Wafer to keep most of his money, except for a good-sized chunk of it, which went towards building a new college in Virginia. That's right, using stolen treasure, and whether he wanted to be or not, a pirate by the name of Lionel Wafer became one of the founding fathers of the College of William and Mary, the second oldest and one of the higher-ranked universities in the United States of America. Lionel Wafer and his many pseudonyms disappear from the historical record around 1700. Historians think he died around 1705, aged about 45 and probably not very rich. He never returned to marry Chief Lacenta's beautiful daughter. I believe that one should trust but verify each source. A medical study or a personal memoir is only as reliable as its methodology and author. So, an analysis of the source itself is important when triangulating the perceptible truth. This story is based on the autobiographies and memoirs of numerous pirates of the era, court testimonies, contemporaneous maps, and other historical documents. While it's easy to dismiss these stories as fanciful, the pirates as brutes, full of fake bravado, I urge a degree of caution. On the one hand, it's possible these stories are a historical fiction of sorts. However, I tend to believe Wafer's character is unlikely to exaggerate his story too much, due to a combination of factors. He was a man of science, a surgeon, who was aware of and admitted to his flawed memory in his writing. As a result, he knew not to rely on his memory alone, but also on the notes that he kept at the time of his travels. He didn't want you to trust his words implicitly either. Instead, he asked the reader to search through the written accounts of his fellow pirates like Basil Ringrose and William Dampier in order to back up what he said. I read through more than 1,000 pages of direct accounts and other historical records such as these, and except for, naturally, a detail here or there, his story and observations seem to largely mirror what others said, saw, and did. Moreover, through his actions and writing, Wafer generally showed some great respect for the native people he encountered, something uncommon to the Europeans of his time and place. Perhaps that says something about his character. All of that may not fully prove that Wafer was telling the truth exactly as it was. He did, after all, omit his arrest and posting bail in Jamestown. Other than embarrassment, one reason for such omissions could be because he warned the reader that his memoir was about the most exciting and interesting parts of his journeys through the Darien, as opposed to a full autobiography of all his travels everywhere in the world in great detail. There's one last thing I leave you with. If anything, the pirates who wrote down their stories during Wafer's time knew they had to be extremely careful, as Wafer's arrest clearly shows. Most likely, they downplayed what they did to a great extent in order to avoid being charged with piracy and other crimes. You see, by the time Wafer and his surviving buddies reached their last days, the tide of court judgments was turning against them, even if the public clamored for their amazing, adventurous stories. All in all, Wafer had to be careful with what he wrote. So, what do you think? How much of this story is exactly as told? How much is an exaggeration? Let me know in the comments below. Cheers.